When it rained, the city seemed repainted for the night. Every curb and gutter took the neon down into itself and held it there like a recollection. The midnight diner stood as a small, stubborn island of light on the wet pavement. Chrome glinting under an awning, a single row of stools, a counter that caught the glow and folded it along the grain of worn wood. The bell above the door made a thin, familiar jangle when it was opened, and steam rose in faint halos from mugs, as if the room were exhaling. If you like quiet night stories like this one, settle in. And if you want more evenings of rain and small mercies, consider subscribing to stay for the next one. Inside, the air smelt of coffee, citrus soap, and cigarette smoke that had long ago learned to be polite. The keeper moved the way someone moves when they have spent too many hours making small arrangements, setting a saucer down where a hand habitually reached, nudging a sugar bowl a hair's breadth closer, smoothing the napkin by pinching and going over the same fold again. He had a soft whistle that slid through the room at regular intervals, an unhurried tune that seemed made for filling gaps rather than for announcing anything new. Regulars answered it without thinking. A head turned, a paper was folded the length of a thumb, and the kettle hissed under the counter as if it were part of the same conversation. There were rituals that read like a map of people. One man, no name given, only the seat he took, always sat on the third stool from the window. He arrived between midnight and 1, with his collar turned up against the rain, and he ordered the same thing without ceremony. Black coffee in the chipped brown mug, a small plate of toast. Butter turned to the precise softness of a memory. The keeper poured the coffee into that mug first, as if laying out a guide, and he slid it across the counter until the rim touched the man's fingers. The man traced the saucer with his index, the same little clockwise motion, and tapped the ashtray with 2 knuckles when he wanted another cigarette lighting. Those gestures were small and exact. Repeated enough times, they became a language. You could leave words unsaid for years and still be heard if you kept the same motions. Others had their own shapes. A woman in a pressed coat tapped twice to call the keeper's attention. A student read until the streetlight outside went pale. An off-duty tram driver warmed his hands over his mug and hummed under his breath. A piano tucked in the corner, sometimes the jukebox, sometimes a neighborly pianist, kept the evenings from falling into silence. The jukebox's needle would settle on an old ballad, then be nudged by a foot, the way people nudged the world back into order. Rituals built recognition in the diner, as weather builds a coastline. Bit by bit, deposit by deposit, until you could navigate by touch. The keeper's fingers remembered where plates ought to sit. The stools learned the contours of bodies. The steam learned when to fog the glass and then let it clear. Recognition lived in muscle memory and in chrome, and in the way the light struck a ring on the counter. For a long while, these repeated acts threaded the nights together without fuss. Then, one winter, the routine developed a small gap. The third stool stayed warm in the mornings, but was no longer warmed at midnight. A mug was poured and left to cool. The keeper set the toast on the plate and waited as if for a word that did not come. At first, the change looked like nothing, the sort of forgetting time permits. But absence has weight. It is not that the door did not open any more. Doors always opened, but it opened in a different rhythm. The bell's jangle lacked the particular cadence of that man's entrance. It was a stranger's quick clink rather than the long, honest note the diner expected. There was no dramatic announcement. No one made a scene. The city supplied its own indifference. the rain continuing to wash the streets as if no one were keeping a vigil. The keeper adjusted more than he would admit. He found himself pouring 1 cup extra, setting an additional saucer into place, answering his own soft whistle when silence grew too long. Once, he slid the mug across the counter halfway, and then drew it back as if remembering the handshake it had used to make. Regulars noticed in the small ways people notice. The way his wrists moved slower when he reached for the milk. The way he left the salt pot untouched, where it had always been nudged for that man's toast. Other patrons made adjustments that were not words. The pianist played a tune a half-step lower, as if tuning to a different light. Conversations thinned in the corners. People made room for a silence they did not want to fill. A newspaper column was folded back to a page the absent man had once preferred. When plates stood waiting, they were not the drama of a neglected order, but the softer drama of ritual without its counterpart. A glove left beside a cup, the faint outline of a thumb on the rim of an untouched mug, a cigarette burned down to a neat nub. Night after night, those small gaps accumulated like rainwater pooling on the awning. The keeper, who had always kept things so that people's habits would meet what they needed, found certain motions rehearsed and unplayed. He would lay a saucer and tilt his head, listening for a whistle of recognition. He would take half a step toward the door as if to stand ready for a familiar footfall, and then he would return to the counter with the muscle memory of readiness still in his shoulders. There is a peculiar ache to the body learning to expect a presence and having to learn again to do without. As the weeks moved, the city around the diner maintained its habitual indifference. Trams hissed, neon blinked and thawed, the rain kept the same steady tempo. But the diner had accrued a history of small, precise events. Even in absence, those events continued to shape how people moved within it. The jukebox needle, which had sometimes been coaxed toward a certain vinyl, sat between tracks more often. One night the keeper thumbed the needle just so, a gesture he would later perform by habit, and the piano picked up the hint as if from memory. The rain that night grew heavier. It was the sort of rain that made people hunch at the collars and kept faces low under hats. The neon outside sketched the pavement into slices of color that slid like slow film. Inside, the diner's light seemed steadier for the contrast, thicker, somehow more patient. The kettle sighed a long, practiced sound, and the whistle slipped out of the keeper's mouth half unconsciously, that familiar tune which had become a bridge. The few regulars present drew the cushioning of their routines close, the paper folded, the mug tipped, a small congregation of habits. It was near the hour when the city sleeps, and its secrets are only half hidden that the bell made its sound. It was not the brisk clink of a stranger. It had a length to it, as if the hand that opened the door had paused, panting the weather out of its coat. A silhouette stood beneath the awning for a breath, moisture freckling the fabric around the shoulders, the collar turned up against the rain. The neon outlined the figure in pale color, drawing a thin halo on the wet ground. Recognition began not as a flash, but as a sequence of small, exact facts. The man in the doorway cleared his throat in a way people had noticed before. Half a cough, a small clearing rather than an attempt to fill the room with noise, and he ran a gloved hand down the front of his coat, arranging the cloth as if smoothing a page that had been folded and put away. He lifted his chin in a way that, once seen, had the authority of habit. Those gestures, so ordinary, were the sort of things the keeper had kept like keys. Not showy, but the right shape to fit a lock. The keeper's hands did not falter. He reached for the chipped brown mug with the same routine he had practiced for years, and set it down on its saucer as though nothing had been absent. He did not ask a name. He did not pause for an explanation. He poured the coffee first, slow and careful, and the steam rose in a steady column. For a moment the diner held its breath in the smallest of ways. A spoon stilled mid-tap. A page of the paper stopped turning. The jukebox seemed to register the note and held it between tracks, sympathetic to the way things found their place again. The man moved to the third stool with the unhurried deliberation of someone resuming an old position. He slid off his wet glove and rested his hand on the counter, palm down, fingers splayed in a posture the keeper knew without being told. The hand itself carried its own cartography, a faint scar near the knuckle, the way the index finger curled slightly, a patch of dry skin at the heel as if from weathered work. These were not dramatic markers, only the honest reports of a life lived, but they were map lines to the keeper's practiced touch. They met recognition not with a speech but with motion. The keeper placed the coffee down so its rim touched the man's fingers and watched for the response that had always followed. The index tracing the saucer in a clockwise arc, the first sip taken in a specific way as if tasting through time. The man did as he had done many times before. He breathed in the steam and his shoulders eased. He set his glove beside the mug, folding it with a careful hand, and his mouth shaped the wordless thanks that years of exchange had rendered unnecessary. There was a touch then, small and precise. The keeper lifted a towel from the rail and pressed it into the man's damp coat sleeve, tucking it as much for warmth as for the ritual of care. His hand found the space between shoulder and collar and rested there for a heartbeat. Flat, steady, not intrusive. The touch said what speech could complicate. You have been missed, but not as a spectacle. You have been missed as someone whose habits count here. The patron's fingers brushed the keeper's briefly, a returned pressure that matched the keeper's own. A recognition answered, a map followed. Others in the room watched in the way people watch a weather change, soft, without commentary. The pianist resumed the thread where it had left off, letting the melody catch at that small beat and then smooth into something ordinary. A spoon resumed rattling in a mug. The man reached for his toast with the same measured motion. Butter gleamed on the surface in a thin strip where his knife had always run. It could have been a scene written large in proclamation, but the power of it lay in its refusal of ceremony. It was domestic, precise, steady. After the first sips, the keeper leaned into practical care. He topped the coffee without flourish, setting a second mug behind it for the habit of having company even when there was none. He fetched a folded blanket from beneath the seat, a heavy, utilitarian thing the diner kept for damp evenings, and draped it over the patron's shoulders with a motion that had been practiced a dozen times before. He did not remark on absence. He did not ask for explanations. Instead, he brought what was needed and arranged things so that the man's hands could find their old paths again. A plate was cleared and replaced with another, warm and ready. The jukebox's needle found its groove and a record spun. Soft, the sort that did not demand attention but filled the air with the texture of shared nights. Conversations picked up where they had left, as if a thread, drawn taut, had been eased and returned to its old place. The city beyond the glass continued to rain and hum, but within the diner the light steadied like a small candle sheltered from the draught. Recognition had come because the rituals had not been abandoned. The whistle, the mug, the mitten tucked by the side. all those small acts had held their shape even through absence. They were the grammar the diner used to speak to people. When a familiar body recrossed the threshold, it answered in the right language. The keeper's gestures were not sentimental, they were professional and exact, the kind of care that repairs the smallest rips in a night's fabric. Later, when the moment had settled into ordinary comfort, the man looked up once and, with a voice softened by weather and time, said a name that the keeper already knew but would not repeat here. It was not an offering for drama, but a small punctuation, an acknowledgment to close the space the absence had opened. The keeper only nodded and returned to his work, hands finding plates and mugs, the much-practiced choreography of a place that keeps its own weather. When the man finally stood to leave, he left as he had come. Slowly, with a hand on the counter for balance, pulling his coat round him in the kind of motion people make when they are preparing to re-enter a world of cold and noise. He straightened the blanket, folded it with a neat crease, and tucked it back under the seat where the keeper could find it again. The bell gave its thin jangle, and the figure slipped back into the rain. The neon traced him briefly and then let him go. Afterward, the diner resumed its other low workings. Dishes were stacked, the kettle came off the hissing flame, and the pianist played on. But the air had shifted in subtle ways. People sipped more slowly as if tasting the return of something they had not known they had missed. A woman at the far end of the counter tucked her paper under her arm and smiled without making a sound. The keeper wiped a saucer and put it into the rack, his hands precise but gentled in their motion. Walking home later, the rain still pattering like a small, constant hand on the shoulders of the city, the thought that lingered was not grand. It was simply that small acts can leave an address on a body, the way a mug fits a palm, the sound that a doorbell makes, the angle at which someone folds a scarf. These are the things that make recognition possible. Absence stretches the map, but the landmarks remain if someone keeps tending them. The midnight diner did not proclaim the reunion. It kept to its rules of hospitality, simple, patient, the kind of care that is offered night after night until it is woven into people's lives. The rain continued. The neon hummed its slow translation of the city. And, in that warm rectangle of light, for as long as it took, the world resembled something steadied. It was not a grand return. It was a rejoining, a familiar hand on a saucer, a towel tucked where a sleeve needed it, a blanket folded back into its hiding place. The keeper straightened a spoon, nodded to a regular, and the room resumed its ordinary, attentive breathing. If this small evening touched you, share it with someone who appreciates quiet reunions. Tell us, in a sentence or two, what ritual has made a place recognizable to you: a mug, a tune, a stool, and keep the map alive.